just having a little bit of a squidgery didgeridoo, as one do. As one does? As one do. And this kind gentleman invited me in for a chai. So they were sitting under the tree here in the shade, having a chai, and now they've wandered off to go and they're sort of cutting all the grass. So you can see further up here, I'm going to look later, it's all weeds. And they're cutting it all by hand. Really, you feel like just going, buying them a whippersnipper. You could get this done in an hour, mate, but this will be the rest of their month's program. Anyway, they love it, I'm sure. Keeps them employed. You guys ready for story time? I thought so. So, when I was a young chap doing my apprenticeship in the electrical trade, what was I? A second year apprentice. I was a young fella, and the war had just started in East Timor. And I got a phone call saying that they needed somebody to reinstate communications in the capital, Dili. And I was like, well, that sounds great, but why me? And I don't have a passport. At the time I was doing quite well in my apprenticeship in the communications industry, and they needed communications reinstated. I don't know who was responsible for it all, but when they found out that I didn't have a passport, they did a quick passport express. I had a passport within 48 hours. Within 48 hours of me getting the phone call that I needed to go to a war zone, I was landing in East Timor during a battle. The Australian Army were pushing out the militia into the mountains, but the whole of Dili was on fire. The militia had cruised through and set everything alight, and so that was pretty wild. Like I got taken to the Australian military camp and shown my place where I was staying in a shipping container. And all night long you could hear the gunfights happening in the jungle just behind me. Just this and you're lying there like, far out, man, what's going on? What the hell's happening here? That was my very first trip overseas. Was paid for, my passport was paid for, and flights and everything like that, and I was staying in a military camp. It wasn't your usual first trip overseas to like Bali or whatever. No, I went to war. Anyway, let's get back to the point, old man storyteller. The point is, where I was working, they were building this bank for Australian troops, I'm pretty sure is what it was mainly for. And they employed some of the locals to clean the floor, and especially in the communications room where I was working. And there was a broom there, and this little fella they'd employed, and he sat down on his skateboard. And he was sitting on a skateboard, and he had a little cushion on the skateboard, and he had just like a box of tissues, and he'd pull a tissue out, and he'd just go along and shuffle along on his skateboard and clean each floor tile at a time with one tissue, and that would be it. And he'd move on to the next one, and he'd get another tissue and clean that floor tile. He had a lot of floor tiles to go, right? And I had a job to do. So I grabbed the broom and said, I'll give him a hand. And he cracked it, man. He was like, oh, don't do that. Like, it would have taken me 5 minutes literally to sweep out the room and get going. So he came in there, took him about, I had to leave him for a day doing it. It was just one little tile at a time, one tissue at a time. Because if he didn't have a floor tile to clean, he wasn't getting paid by, I'm guessing, the Australian government, or the Australian taxpayer was paying for his wages, I'm guessing. So one little step at a time. You think you're helping them out by going, hey, here's a broom, or hey, here's a whippersnipper. He's probably happier. Just this is his job for the rest of the year, is cutting the grass. That's my story. Did one like it?